or the countdown?
Whoops.
Well, good morning, good morning. I'm Susan. Welcome to my studio, Stitched by Susan, as we try and get all our ducks in a row. Me and my husband, producer guy Dave. Got my coffee, ready to start quilting. So I've been showing a couple lead ups to this live and unscripted episode on my social media channels. Perhaps you've seen them and perhaps you haven't, so I'll give you a brief introduction. Each live and unscripted episode, and I stream live every the first and third Monday of each month. I have a quilt loaded on my long arm and I just quilt in real time so that you can see what it looks like to be quilting on a long arm. And most often I'm doing something that is freehand and edge to edge, so just the same design repeated across the entire quilt top. That's what we call edge to edge. But in today's case, it's kind of a special project. So I'm quilting a custom quilt. It's not a very large one, and it's called The Mountains Are Calling. I think Dave's going to throw up a photograph here of the entire quilt for you so you can kind of see where we're going. I've quilted this one before. I've even streamed the quilting of them before, so you've seen some of those details. But today I'm going to do this whole quilt in 2 sessions because it is going to take some hours. So the first one is starting now, which is 9 o'clock my time, and then the second one will be 5 p.m. this evening Pacific time. And these replays will be available too, so you can always come back and watch them later. So you're getting a glimpse there of what the whole quilt looks like on the screen, and an idea of what type of quilting I'll be doing. So there's going to be a fair bit of stitching in the ditch, some color changes going on, and then some different custom fills in the different areas. So all of those things will be part of today's video. Now, usually when I'm quilting, I'm talking. I don't have any trouble talking. So I usually talk my way through the decisions I'm making, you know, why I'm quilting this instead of that, why I choose this thread color instead of that sort of thing. But today, because I know this project is going to be quite time consuming, I'm going to spend more time just quilting because all the talking sort of takes up my time. So does that make sense? So today I thought that I would do about every half hour. I will answer questions. So as we're streaming, as you're watching, be typing your questions into the chat window, maybe with a cue in front so that we notice them in the stream or can go back and find them. And then every half hour, top of the hour, bottom of the hour, I'll take a few minutes to answer questions that you have and maybe talk about what I'm going to do next, that sort of thing. So let's see, what else do we need to talk about before we get going, Dave? Couple of my favorite tools that I'll be using today. One is this quite simple 9-inch straight ruler. It's by the A1 machine brand. It's just a ruler that I love. In the interest of time saving, I have already loaded the quilt today. If that's a process you want to see, check out some of my other YouTube videos. Most of them, I show the loading process as well and talk my way through that. So if you like these videos and enjoy watching them, be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. And if you hit the bell as well, then you'll be notified every time a new episode comes available. So that's helpful. And one other thing too, these episodes are free to listeners and watchers on my YouTube channel, but if you're interested in supporting me, I have this nifty little app called buymeacoffee.com. You guys know I love my morning coffee. And so on that app, you can do just a one-time contribution if you wish, or if you want to, you can sign up for a $5 a month commitment. So just know that when you get to that website, you'll need to choose the membership or just support. It's just a one-time donation. So for the price of one, you know, nice coffee, you can help us out. So I want to add to that too. We've had that up and running for a couple of months, and you watchers have been so very generous that we have some new equipment that we're streaming with today. So one is a new hub. So the wires from all the cameras that are feeding into the computer that Dave, the producer guy, is managing, that hub is brand new. And also I have a new camera on Lucy. And of course you won't be able to see the camera, but it'll be what's providing the close-up look of the needle. So hopefully you're getting a clearer and nicer view today. So thanks to you viewers, because the little Buy Me a Coffee app is what has provided the money for both these upgrades. So we're pretty tickled about that. Thank you so much for them. So we're going to get on to quilting. Let me just get one sip of my coffee and say hello to people, and we'll get going. Alrighty, let's see who's chiming in this morning. Oh, you have to make it a bit bigger, Dave. Can't read that. Louise looks like from Colorado. Good morning. Northern Sue, hello from Bancroft. I've seen Northern Sue here before. Sherry from Oregon, nice, welcome. Glad you could join. Jeannie from the other side of Canada. Thanks for sharing your time with us. You're welcome. Thanks for sitting and watching me. And I should mention too, this is a great episode if you're working on something at home, whether you're working in your craft room or you're baking or you're on the treadmill. It's a great episode to kind of just be having going in the background. So you can kind of watch this process big picture, you know, but some of it is repetitive. So not a thing that you have to pay focused attention to every second. But that's all for this morning. Wow. Okay. We're going to get started. So I mentioned I've got the quilt all loaded already. My backing, which you can't see now, but we'll get glimpses of as we go, is, there you go. It's actually a vintage, I would say 70s. So maybe that's not vintage, but a retro bed sheet. And I use bed sheets actually for quilt backings whenever I can find them, which is not all that often. And it works well, but here's a tip. Don't use the ones that have a super high thread count, you know, the 400, 600, 800 Egyptian cotton thread count. They're too tight of a weave and too hard to quilt through, and you'll get significant needle holes in them. But the older sheets or even the less expensive sheets do work well as quilt backings. And Penny, good morning. Still on vacation in Oregon. Nice. Wow, I'm honored that you choose to watch me while you're on vacation. Oh, more people coming in. Good. Michelle, hi there. And Darlene from Montana, MT City. Is that Montana City? I'm not sure. But anyway, Montana. I know that much. And Jeannie, hope you guys get your trip to Ontario. So to clarify, our trip is to Canada, but it's to BC. So we live in Washington State. So we're traveling due north. And we are planning on going in just a couple weeks' time. So we're pretty darn excited about that. Those of you who watch me know because I've moaned about it a few times. We have a little granddaughter that we last saw when she was a couple weeks old last February, and we haven't seen her since in real life. And so we're pretty excited to be going. One more thing that I want to mention before we get going. You guys saw the picture of the whole quilt, right? And so Dave's going to maybe throw that up again. So often when I load my quilts, you've noticed that I load them sideways, so lengthwise from side to side. And the reason I do that is because then there's fewer advances of the quilt. So when it doesn't matter to my quilting, when it's just the same type of quilting all over the whole thing, that's more efficient. But in this case, I'm doing custom quilting. And so I looked at the quilt and I saw, you can see on the picture, you know, more of the sky and geese areas at the top, you know, trees kind of through the middle, grass along the bottom. And I'm going to be changing thread colors for those things. So I wanted to have the areas more horizontal. Does that make sense? So I've loaded my quilt top to the top, bottom to the bottom. So that gives you an idea where we're going. Do we want to look at a couple more pictures? Yes. So these photographs are of another version of this quilt that I've done previously, but it'll give you an idea too of where we're going today. So this is the sun with some pretty rays quilted in it, and you can see a bit of the geese too. That particular version was done with 100% flannels, so it was very thick and very bulky to work with, but also a very cozy and warm effect. So mine that I'm working on today is done with quilting cottons out of my stash and a few vintage fabrics. I've got a vintage tablecloth that I had at one time cut up and a kind of canvasy textural kind of thing. I just use things out of my stash to make my whole quilt top. Another picture, there you see the trees and some of the details I'm going to put in and the grasses. So I'm doing that same type of quilting today. So that's what you can look forward to seeing. And one more, the mountains. So I used actually feathers and straight parallel lines to create sort of this mountain peak texture and set one peak against the other. So that's what I'm going to be doing today as well. Okay, that's all the photos. So we're going to get going. Quilt is loaded and basted already. And so I've put my ruler plate underneath so that I've got a base to rest my ruler on. And it's about 10 inches by 8, I would say. So that gives me a nice flat area to rest my ruler on when I'm quilting. And I see something that I missed in my loading while Dave's adjusting the camera. I need my stretchers on the side. So one moment while I get them on. So this is one of the decisions that I did not foresee the outcome of when I loaded this sheet onto my machine. It still has the hems on the sides, and they are too bulky actually to fit in the slim little channels of my stretchers. So I am today just going to use my clamps. I don't love clamps because they pull at a single point where the clamp is. So I'm just going to be sure that I only have quite light tension on them. So guys, Dave's going to mute me for a minute and we're just going to confer here for a second, and I will be right back with you. You've got some nice music on for the people? And we'll just be a few seconds here. We've got to resolve an issue. Okay guys, we're back on camera. So we have discovered something that we did not foresee either, and really I have mentioned this is totally live and unscripted, right? So you're seeing us work through problems. Although we tried to do trial runs, we did not see all of this. So what you're seeing now is that when I use my hand on the little camera, you saw it in a couple shots there, it pretty much obliterates the view from my camera, which we have really close in to pick up on the needle. So I'm going to let you guys actually chime into the comments. Would you like me to stay that close in so that you can really see on the needle? Or would you like us to go off air for 5 or 6 minutes and load up the other camera again, where you would get a better view that doesn't have the back of my hand in it? Does that make sense? So Dave will change the view again. Those of you who are regular watchers know what it typically looks like. And here's what it is today. So I've got, you can see how my hand is right under that camera because of just the way that it's pointed at the needle. So chime in, a couple of you guys, if you want to. I'll quilt for a minute or two and you can have the, could we put the big view camera on, Dave? There we go. So we'll leave that camera view on for a couple of minutes. I'm going to go ahead and keep quilting. But you guys chime in with kind of what your preference would be. I'm leaning towards stopping and changing out the camera. And it's funny, we've quilted and done some taping with this camera on, but I did not think to actually do ruler work and try that out. So we are going to make an executive decision because I'm finding too that this camera is really just in the way of my hand motions as well. So we're going to come back to this one for our next live and unscripted, you know, when we're doing a edge to edge design, and it will be super nice for you guys to see that clearly. But for today's purposes, we are actually going to go off air, and it should take, I'm sorry, what's that, Dave? Okay, my apologies. Dave says we're going to remain on air, but we're just going to remove this camera, so it's going to take about 5 minutes of time that I won't have, quilting going on. So you guys refresh your coffee or whatever you need to do, and we'll get that done and be right back in just a couple of minutes with actual quilting. Okay, now we've got the mic back working, apparently. So, I know I promised you guys that I was going to do less talking, but it turns out I have a story to tell. I know that comes as a great surprise to you guys. But anyway, a couple weeks ago, just as you're seeing, playing out the challenges of live streaming and the things that you can't necessarily anticipate, a couple of weeks ago I was a guest on another gentleman's YouTube channel, and it's called launchyour.live. And he interviews people who do live streaming for all kinds of things. But he had never done a quilter before, and I don't think there are that many long arm quilters out there that do this type of live streaming that is just a reality show, basically. And so we really had fun talking about the challenges that we face. And I say we, meaning Dave and I, because there's just always these unpredictable things, and we're always dealing with this very large piece of equipment that Lucy is, and figuring out how to give you guys the best video we can manage. With the equipment that we have. So we'll keep working at it. I'm just taking a second here to, because this is a goose that is only partial, I'm just going to draw in a very sketchy look at where my lines would be. I'm eyeballing the placement on most of these geese, but in this case, I have a hard time eyeballing, you know, the partial. And so I'm just going to go ahead and draw that in. So I know where I'm heading. batch of geese, I'll try and be a little more systematic in how I progress so that I don't miss areas of detail. I'm doing these in a kind of haphazard fashion, which is not the end of the world, but it's kind of how I keep myself amused when I'm quilting, is thinking through efficient thread paths. A few of these thread path choices I know from previous processes of quilting this particular project, and one of them is, I know that when I have green thread loaded, I'm going to do my stitching in the ditch or outlining of the trees with that green thread, so I'm not doing it with my teal. So don't forget, if you have any questions about things that I am doing or decisions I made in this process, go ahead and be typing them into the chat window, and whenever I can, at about the half-hour mark, I will take a break to read all of those and answer them as best I can while I work. Stitching in the ditch by definition means stitching on the ditch side of these seams, which are pressed to one side. So I did put a little bit of thought into this when I was piecing the quilt, because some of the seam allowances are quite bulky. I've got the bottoms of one row of geese going left and the bottoms of the next row going right, if that makes sense. So when I'm within the goose, when I'm quilting the ditch of the goose, and some of them you may see that I'm quilting on the goose print, and some of them I'm quilting on the background, and that's why I'm just following wherever that ditch is. And that's not 100%. Where I'm stitching right now, you can see I inadvertently stitched on the hill, not the ditch, which is on the background fabric. But it's still neat and straight, and I choose to just leave it. But in general, it looks better to stitch on the ditch side. It adds that extra definition, which is kind of why you're stitching in the ditch to begin with. And where I leave off my meandering here, I'm kind of purposely leaving a jagged bottom so that when I advance my quilt and do the next row of it, you know, it will look seamless. It will look like they were all done at once in one pass. And that's just accomplished by leaving that kind of jagged edge, which I will then fill in the next pass. As you can see, I'm not pre-marking my interior lines in these geese. That's entirely a personal decision. And I chose to do it in the interest of time. It would add quite a lot of time if I pre-marked those lines. But if you're not reasonably confident in your ability to get them pretty even, you might want to mark them. Or even put a dot at the top point of them right there to give you a point to aim toward. But I'm okay with eyeballing it. I'm okay with the result being a little casual. In my freehand classes, one of the points I kind of hammer home to my poor students is that you need to be able to quilt any given motif in every direction. And you're seeing the value of that here today. Because of the direction I've loaded the quilt, it means all my geese, or most of my geese in the quilt, are flying to one side or the other. And so I have to be able to quilt the L loops sideways and get them to look, you know, reasonably uniform and not squashed. So it's really, really important in your practice. Don't spend too much time avoiding quilting things that go in a direction that feels awkward. Rather, focus on practicing that direction until you can quilt a given motif, no matter which direction it's headed in. Pausing for a sec. That was just a little mic adjustment. We're trying to reduce the static as best we can. I trust Dave has some nice music going for you. And like I said, this is an excellent episode to be, you know, working on something in your own sewing studio, craft room, or even in your kitchen. Because there will be a fair bit of repetitive work throughout this project. I find this particular quilt quite rewarding though. The first one I did was actually for Janet Nesbitt. It's the cover photo on the pattern. And it was just really fun that first time through to work out how quilted textures could accentuate and bring to life the different natural areas on the quilt. The tree boughs, the grasses, the snowy peaks. And I was so happy with how it turned out that this is now quilt number 4 that I'm doing of this pattern, and I've used, by and large, the same textures throughout. Some have had more detail than others. This one probably will have the most. So for anyone who happens to be just joining in or just stopping by my channel at the moment, I am quilting on my long arm today, and I'm quilting this entire custom project. And because it is going to take some hours, we've broken it down into 2 sessions. So this is session 1 going on right now, and the second one will be at 5 Pacific time this evening. So throughout, I'll be doing techniques like stitching in the ditch, as I'm doing right now, some ruler work, and a number of custom fills like the little loops that are in these geese, some special things in the sun, in the mountain peaks, and so forth. As well, there will be a number of thread color changes and stops and starts, obviously because I'm changing threads, but for other reasons too, and moving around the quilt. So the purpose of this episode is to just kind of give you a bird's eye view of what it looks like to custom quilt a project like this. You know, what kind of steps do I take when I'm changing thread color? Where do I put stitching in the ditch, and where do I maybe leave it off? Those sorts of things. So I'm not, because I have to concentrate a bit on this, I'm not talking my way through all of it as I sometimes do, but just kind of letting you look over my shoulder. You are welcome to ask questions, as always. Just be putting them in the chat window at any time. And every half hour or so, I'll take a few minutes to let Dave run a few of those questions across the screen for me, and then I'll try and answer them as I'm working. I'm just trying to be efficient with my time because I realize this is going to take a good chunk of today. So, and also with custom work, you do have to stay focused. When I'm doing my more typical edge-to-edge stuff, you can do it a little more on mental autopilot. But I have to pay attention here. I forget where I've been and where I'm going next and those sorts of things. So after this goose, I am going to pause and take a couple questions. Or these two geese, I guess, when I get to the outer edge again. For those of you who are here today, I'm so glad you've chosen to come. I know this is not necessarily glamorous. It's a little like watching paint dry sometimes when it takes a while. But I just know, I can still recall that all the decisions that have to be made and the indecision I felt when doing my first custom quilts. You know, what do I do next? Or what do I do about thread color changes? Or, you know, how picky do I have to be when I'm stitching in the ditch? Those sorts of things. So hopefully just by having the chance to watch, that will help you make some of those decisions when you're working on your own projects. Okay, let's stop and have a couple questions, and I'll have a sip of my coffee or my water. Oops. Well, Lucy's there we go. We got it. Just keeping my coffee off the quilt. Okay, comments are coming first. Dave is maybe you've been commenting a lot because Dave is just scrolling through the screen. Amanda, you guys do a great job. Thank you for your videos. You're so welcome, but it is encouraging because sometimes, as with this morning, you know, it doesn't go really smoothly. And sometimes I think, oh gosh, do people really want to even be seeing this? Seeing me pull my hair out a little bit? But on the other hand, I think maybe it can be helpful to just see behind the scenes how it's done. Another one, Sally, the view is great now. Good. I'm glad that's improved. I think too this is a better choice. We'll try out the new camera next time. Northern Sue, haphazard is my middle name. I start out with a great plan, then all of a sudden I'm winging it. You know, truth. The trick is in being able to wing it and have a great end result anyways. Mickey, a little late. Good afternoon from North Georgia Mountains. Welcome, Mickey. Okay, questions coming up. Northern Sue, does Lucy ever give you grief when quilting in any specific direction? Occasionally she does. And I think I've talked about this in more length in some other episodes, but I've been able to tweak that with turning the needle just a hair in a given direction. Usually that's my go-to choice, and usually she only gives me grief if I'm quilting a long straight line. Right to left is generally the problem that quilters encounter. It has to do with the timing of the needle and the rocker of the bobbin and how those exactly work together. So that's why that tiny little turn of the needle will sometimes shift that timing just a hair and help with that problem. Check with your dealer or other people who use your brand of machine maybe for more fine-tuning of that. Jeannie, do you have a quilting plan before you start? Yes, I do. And as I mentioned, Jeannie, I've quilted this particular design of quilt several times before, and so I've got that idea firmly in my head. I'm adding a few more details because this is my quilt and it's my own time and I choose to spend it. But the basic idea is the same. Sherry, what type or color of thread are you using? Thanks for camera change. It's great. Good. I'm using Isocord thread today all the way through. Isocord is 100% poly, 40 weight thread. I like it because it's strong, because it's poly. So it was originally designed and is still used for embroidery. So for like caps and chef's aprons and logos and things like that is what the thread was designed for. So it's strong and therefore really suitable for a high-speed machine. And it comes in over 300 colors, so I love all the colors. I currently have a teal. I picked one that is just a little bit lighter than my tealy background because I didn't want to have to change for the geese, which are much paler, but I've chosen to use that same teal throughout all the geese and sky. Yes, saw Mickey's comment already. Great. Okay. This is Dave talking about me. I'm on a mission today, on again this evening to finish the project, about 5 to 6 hours in total. That we're guesstimating is really what we're doing. If it looks like it's going to take way long, I may do some quilting between the 2 sessions, but for sure every segment, so the geese, the tree, the sun, the mountains, I will show every segment throughout the episodes today. So they have different textures and different styles of quilting in each one. So hopefully that will give you some ideas for your next quilt too. Alrighty, Dave just had me on mute for half a second because he was clarifying something that I didn't realize in my attempts to stay calm and keep quilting. This is actually the new camera, it's just in a different location. So for those of you who are regular watchers, I'd love to hear from you how you think it's doing. Like, we feel like it's super nice and clear, and it is particularly designed to deal with vibration because that's always something we've struggled with. Because it is actually mounted on Lucy. So vibration has always been a thing we've tried to work hard at reducing. So I'd love to know how you think this one is doing. Judging by your feedback so far, pretty good. So for the moment, I'm doing fairly repetitive work, so I'm going to lapse back into my habit of talking. When I set out to make this quilt, I had already quilted 3 of them for other people, and they were all made out of flannel, as is the original pattern, and Janet Nesbitt's fabrics, which were all her design as well, the flannels that are in the original quilt. So I've quilted it a few times on flannel, and I thought to myself, I just wonder how it would look done in cottons, and in sort of my taste of color, which is a little bit brighter, a little more contemporary. So that's what you're seeing me working on here today, and I'm quite proud of myself. These are all fabrics out of my stash. I didn't buy a single inch of fabric. I just hunted through everything that I own, and there are some different textiles in here, and I quite like that, the different textures. So there's one in the mountains that's quite a loose weave. It looks a bit like canvas, although it's not stiff like canvas. It's a loose weave, and then there's one that I don't even know what the fabric content is. It was a vintage tablecloth, and it also is in the mountains. It's one of the white fabrics, and it's just got a pretty textural quality to it. And then among these geese, I've got a number of sort of usual cottons. There's some Bonnie and Camille here. There's some Natural Born Quilter here. And then I've got some Essex linen in some of these geese. So again, I was kind of trying to add that little bit of textural quality, which seems very suitable for this quilt. And among the trees in particular, like, I was digging into my little scraps and used sort of every square inch of some of them. I think there's one fabric that only appears one time. There's just one green piece, because that's all I had was this little stub of green fabric. I find it quite fun to challenge myself to use what I have, and the backing was kind of in that vein too. I don't know that I would look at the backing and say, wow, I love that, it's the perfect thing, but it's something I had. So I'll post photos as always My tension is poor. I'm just going to adjust that a bit. I'll post pictures after it's done and you'll get a good view of the backing. And I see why the tension is poor. I just ran out of bobbin thread, which would totally make sense. Because of course the last 3 or 4 inches, there is no tension on the bobbin thread. So now what I usually do here, for those of you who are new, I don't try to determine when my bobbin is running low with the computer on my machine or with most bobbin indicators rely on so many revolutions of the bobbin, which of course changes with every type of thread you use and that sort of thing. So I have a very simple method. When it runs out, I get a new one. But what it also means is those last few inches always have poor tension, so I just undo them and I accept that as the price of my lazy method of knowing when it's going to run out. It's not always in fussy areas like this, but it is today. So bear with me while I take a couple inches out. And again today, in the interest of time, I tried to pre-fill my bobbins as many as I judged I would need, and so I've got them already done and ready to just load up. But usually when I'm quilting, I just go grab a fresh bobbin, and at the same time I put a new one on my freestanding bobbin winder to load. It just takes a few seconds to change it over and put a new one on the winder, and I choose to do that so that I can have matching thread colors as opposed to buying pre-wound bobbins, which come in very limited colors. I just have to make sure not to pull Lucy too far and knock a camera over. That would not be good. So I am using, for the lady that asked the thread question, I have the same thread. Whoops! I just dropped my bobbin. Casing and thread. You guys know what happens then. The bobbin rolls, the thread unwinds. Anyway, I have the same thread, top and bottom. Sometimes if my threads were fairly close in darkness, I guess, color saturation maybe, I would use the same thread throughout on the bottom and just be changing on the top. But today I have quite a variation of threads going on. There's green, there's blue, there's copper. I'm having a really hard time reaching. Bear with me a second here. I can't pull Lucy any closer to me because of the camera, and I'm having a hard time reaching the bobbin casing. Got it. Now I just have to put my clamp back on. Okay, we're in business. So I just undid my stitching, as you saw, back to the nearest sort of point. I dropped my scissors there because that just helps me remember where I was. This is not a terribly busy quilt, so it's not critical, but that's just a habit in me to drop something where my splice point is, and then I'll just take a couple tiny stitches there and keep going. Alright, so once again, Dave and I were just conferring a wee bit off microphone. He's going to put several views on the screen at once. And you guys chime in as to which one is most helpful. Like whether, for example, you like having the 3 things going at once so you can get all these different vantage points, or whether that's just confusing and you'd rather just have one view at a time and go back and forth between. I really do value your feedback there, because it's sometimes hard for me, knowing what I'm doing, to kind of understand how that's coming across to someone who doesn't know what's coming next. didn't use stippling in my quilting for quite a long period of time, it kind of had this stigma of boring attached to it. But I've recently quite fallen in love with it again as a fill for this type of thing, because it's textural and not too distracting to the eye, honestly. I still don't love a big meander. You'll never catch me just doing a, 3 or 4 inch meander across a quilt top, but that's just personal preference. But I do very much like it as a little fill like this. And you can see how I'm just directing it to end up at the next point that I want to start quilting. In this case, the next point of the goose. And if you're wondering why I scoot ahead and do the stitching in the ditch on the next goose before I do that meander, I feel like when I do the meander first, it pulls the goose just a little bit askew. You probably can't see it on camera because you're at an angle, but when I'm looking at it straight on, it pulls the bottom of that goose kind of rounded. So I like to go and stabilize that bottom before I come back and do this meandering. I don't think it's critical. I just think if it's 6 of one, a half a dozen of the other, I might as well do that first. Again, I know going into this from doing this quilt before that I'm going to stitch in the ditch around this sun with the coppery colored thread, and so I'm not doing it with the blue. As I go past these edges, I will stitch on the copper fabric with copper thread a little later on. Did you notice that I forgot to guide myself to the bottom of that goose? Tisk, tisk. Put a little meander in there. So I'm just choosing to stitch back over. It's just one more pass on that little stitching in the ditch. Nobody but you will ever know, and you'll never tell, right? And again, buzzing up and stabilizing the bottom of this goose. I got myself a little off track with my methodicalness last time, so I'm just going to go back and finish this stitching here. Or sorry, backtrack through the ditch stitching and finish the meandering. It just does not always work to talk and quilt at the same time. The tongue does not always stay engaged to the brain. There we are. Back on track. Another great thing about the meandering is it is a very easy fill to move around. So if I need to shift, you know, where I want to go next, where I want my needle to be, it's a good way to kind of travel. My ideal is always to have a loop in the center because I think it accentuates the tall point in the middle of the goose. But as you saw with that one, it just does not always come out that way. Threads out of there. I will tell you for sure, quilting on cotton is a lot easier than quilting on flannel. The seam allowances that existed in this on the flannel were pretty significant, especially on the corners of these geese. that is much easier this time around. Last goose in this particular flight formation. So we're at about the 1 hour mark, so in a few seconds here I'll take some more questions when I get to the end of this row. So if you've got any questions or comments, now's the moment to pop them into the chat window. For those who may just be joining in, today's live and unscripted episode is this custom quilt. The pattern is The Mountains Are Calling by Janet Nesbitt. Her original pattern is all done in flannels. Mine, as you see, is cottons, all from my stash. A little bit brighter colors. I've quilted this design before, and so I kind of know what I'm doing and where I'm going, and have it sort of mapped out in my head. But throughout the day I'll be doing the different colors that are involved, the green, the copper, etc., the teal, which I'm working on now, the white of the mountains, some different textures, stitching in the ditch, some simple ruler work, and different fills. And because I know this will be a fairly lengthy project, we're going to do one session this morning, which we began at 9 o'clock Pacific time, and another at 5 o'clock this evening. The replays will be available on my YouTube channel. So if you find this episode helpful and want to know when more are occurring, just like and subscribe and hit the little bell button, and you'll get notified whenever new episodes come up. Most of my YouTube videos are what I call live and unscripted. It's me live streaming my quilting, warts and all, thread breaks and all. I think last time actually we had a needle fall out while I was quilting. So yeah, you get to see sort of how I deal with those mini emergencies and just look over my shoulder and watch the process. I know that as a new quilter, I was kind of desperate to see that type of thing. You know, how does a quilter make these decisions on the fly? You know, is it okay to break thread in the middle of a quilt? Do you have to tie off and bury all the threads? All those sorts of things. And because you can't easily work with each other in your studios, you just don't get to see another person doing it. So I hope that these live and unscripted episodes will kind of answer that need, as you can look over my shoulder and see how I quilt. Boy, I struggled with staying in the ditch on that goose. When you're doing this type of work, you kind of have to find your own trim. You know, how accurate does it need to be to make you happy? I think that I'm a careful quilter, but I'm also a casual one, so I don't expect perfection out of my quilting. It is hand done, and I want it to look like that. I was talking a few minutes ago about being comfortable quilting, particularly the little L-shaped loops in every direction. So this is in the nature of a confession. I chose to drop down and quilt some other things on the goose to get myself over to my left so that I can quilt my L's from left to right, because it is still easier. and they are showing up quite a bit on this quilt because of the somewhat contrasting thread. So I just give you permission to do that. And here we are at those L's. Even for all that, I did not manage to get one in the middle. Now we got one in the middle. Perfect. And here we are, and I cannot reach forward far enough without advancing the quilt to do another goose. So I'm just taking 4 or 5 tiny stitches in my little ditch stitching there, and I'm going to break thread right here. Okay, good time for some questions if we have them while I work on advancing the quilt. And I will move so you guys can see me. Okay, question? Northern Sue, I'm curious about comparison of 2 fabric types. Is the flannel project softer, fluffier, or both similar? Oh, it's definitely fluffier and probably softer, you know, because flannel just feels different to the touch. But it also is a bit heavier as a whole. The ones that I did on flannel were flannel tops and flannel bottoms, so they were definitely a little bit heavier, a little bit cozier. The wide view is the least favorite due to distortion. The close-up view is my favorite. It shows the image well on the darker fabric. And that was, I think, Louise, if I remember your name correctly. Good. That is helpful to know. Close-up. Good. Close-up view. So then I think what we'll probably go toward today anyways is doing mostly that close-up view and just occasionally having the big picture view. I just feel like that helps you to keep things in perspective of where I'm working and what the floating top looks like and those sorts of things. So, everyone likes the music on but low. Good, and a big thank you, by the way, at this moment to my friend Dan Unger, who is the gentleman playing the guitar and allows us to use his music. We sure appreciate that. It is very nice. Okay, so we're advancing the quilt. My top is floating. And if you're not familiar with that term, I will show you as I'm setting it up. Basically, I've got my backing was rolled onto the rollers, and I laid my batting on the top of it, and then I attached my quilt at the top and basted that top edge, and the front just floats. It's just hanging down in front of me. So I prefer to quilt that way. I do that pretty much all of the time. There are reasons why you would want to base the whole thing in advance or roll it on your rollers, but I typically don't. I typically choose this. So when I advance it, then I give a few tugs to make sure there's no batting up in underneath there. If you have any questions about that, you might even want to flip up the quilt top and have a look. But I can feel that's pretty smooth. I can see the sides of it. It's advancing pretty straight. And then I use my seam lines of my quilt as a kind of visual guide to keep things straight, and I put magnets on the front bar to hold it in place, so that as I'm quilting in the middle here, it's not pulling up the center of my quilt. And then I will baste each side in position. Every time I advance, I baste those edges. Sure, there's one more question. When you drop your bobbin and it rolls away, do you cut that thread off or do you wind it back on with your hand? It's a waste of thread to cut, but I'm wondering about the tension on the bobbin. I usually wind it on. The only reason I don't is if it for some reason tangles into a knot, then I just break it off. That's just personal preference, I think. Okay, Couple more things while I am basting these side edges and putting my clamps on and so forth, all the mechanics. Just to let you know, this coming weekend I'm doing a couple sessions of my all over feather boot camp again. So if you've ever wanted to quilt an all over feather, which to my mind is one of the most beautiful all over textures that there is, this will be a very thorough and quite intensive look at quilting those. So I start right from the beginning, start from quilting the single plume and then go through, you know, how to make it curve and bend around your quilt, and then how to cover an entire quilt surface evenly with it, and lots of tips and tricks throughout. So I will be running that boot camp this coming weekend, Saturday and Sunday, 3 times. So they're the same material. It's not like session 1, session 2, session 3. Same material, just at 3 different times, so that as many people as possible can catch. Now, can I tell you what times they are? I believe Saturday is at 5 p.m. Eastern is the first one. But I tell you what, if you are on my newsletter, you will have received notification of it, and there will be another one yet this week. So it's always an option to go to my website and sign up for the newsletter for the exact times on that. And maybe for this afternoon session, I'll get my head in gear and have those times in my head. At any event, there's one Saturday evening, and there is one Sunday morning, and another Sunday afternoon. All the same content, just presented 3 times. They are all live. The video, the tutorial, if you will, is pre-recorded, but I talk and present the whole thing live every time. So much like this, you can ask questions too. It's interactive. Those who come to one session are welcome to bring their drawings and practice to the next one and show me, those sorts of things. Okay, got to decide here if I want to go ahead with my blue and quilt more geese, or if I want to change colors. I think we'll do a few more geese. And those of you who are really paying attention may notice that in this area where I'm working now, I made some changes from the pattern, and that was strictly personal preference. The original pattern had more geese and kind of portions of geese in behind these trees, and I chose to put more sky instead. Dave is going to put a link into the chat notes of where the pattern can be found. As I mentioned, it's by Janet Nesbitt of One Sister Designs. I will say, in my humble opinion, it's not a quilt for the faint of heart. There's some complexity. It's not difficult sewing. There's just some complexity because every area is so different. So it's very much the kind where you have to pay attention. You just do. So I did most of my piecing actually at a quilting retreat, which was perfect because I just had my head in it, had it spread out on the floor for that whole weekend. It would be very difficult to do a little bit and then put it away and then come back and do a little bit more and find out where you are. So if you've done any piecing, you'll be able to recognize that just by looking at it. You just have to keep track of all the areas and sections and what have you. But it's not difficult piecing by any means, difficult sewing or techniques. And it's very pretty and very unique. So once again, I'm not stitching in the ditch with my teal thread around the trees because I already know that I want to do that with my green thread when I'm quilting the trees. Because I've got my quilt basted at the sides and I've got my stretchers putting a wee bit of tension on that, and I've got my magnets on the front. Everything is held pretty still and pretty straight. I don't have to worry too much about those trees shifting. My stippling, if you're having a hard time telling sort of what the scale of it is, I would say is a little under 1/4 of an inch. Just for the fun of it, maybe Dave will run us a poll about stippling. So first off, do you like stippling, yes or no? Or maybe a secondary question, do you think it has its uses in certain ways? I think I said earlier already, you'll never catch me doing a big old 3-inch stipple all over a quilt top that I've spent time piecing. However, I do love the texture of it and the smaller scale, and I've really fallen lately into using it to do just some filling areas. It's an easy one because it travels easily to move from one area to another. And I do like the texture it provides. So the question is, stippling, yes or no? Do you have an aversion or do you like it? And do you have particular applications that you like it in? I think in this central area I can get right to the bottom. Yes, I can. Excellent. So to begin my stippling out in the middle, I'm just going to anchor my thread right in where that green ditch stitching is going to be. I think that's the most unobtrusive part. And again, just anchoring it with 3 or 4 tight stitches. Not quite in one hole, but almost. And I want to do this kind of long, thin area that goes down into the center of my quilt. And so I'm purposely quilting all down one edge, and then I'll work my way back up, filling that all in. When you're doing small stippling like this, I also think it looks better if you have a fairly small stitch length on. I think I've got 14 set. I can't look up right now because then I would run amok. And this is the type of quilting where if your quilt does not do that fine of stitch, as my first long arm didn't, 12 was as fine as I could go, then my answer was to learn how to stipple with the constant speed on, because then I could control the stitch length. And I got a much smoother looking stipple with a finer stitch length that didn't have as squarish looking of corners. And honestly, if I wasn't on camera, I would be doing that here too. I would be putting this on constant speed and just flipping back and forth between constant and regulated, depending on what I was stitching. But because I have enough things on my brain, I'm not going to do that, because sure enough, if you've ever done it, you know what it feels like to have the constant speed on at a high speed and not be aware of that and turn your machine on and all of a sudden it starts racing. Yeah, that would not be pretty. So for today, I'm going to stick on regulated while I'm focused on talking to you guys. So for those who may just be tuning in for a few minutes, this is one of my YouTube episodes which I call Live and Unscripted, my quilting reality show, in which I welcome you into my studio to just look over my shoulder at the current day's project. This one happens to be custom quilting, so we're going to have some different techniques like stitching in the ditch, some ruler work, some pretty fills, thread color changes, those sorts of things. These episodes are always free on my YouTube channel. However, if you wish to support and help us upgrade equipment and things like that, we have a little app called buymeacoffee.com, and I invite you, if you wish, to go there and make a one-time contribution. Now, I do also have a coffee and cream membership set up if you want to commit to $5 a month. So just be aware that when you get to that little site, you can either choose that small membership or you can choose support, which is just a single time donation. And we sure do appreciate your generosity. With what we've received from buymeacoffee.com, we were able to purchase recently a new camera, which is what you're watching on right now. So it is a kind of specialty camera geared toward reducing vibration while producing a really clear shot. So we have added that new camera and a new hub for Dave, who's producing, and he manages all the wires and getting all the, the feed to end up at one place, and it's really helpful for him to have a better quality hub to do that. So those are a couple things that we've already been able to do thanks to your support. So we really, really appreciate that. If you're enjoying this episode and finding it helpful on YouTube, I invite you to like and follow my channel. And if you click on the little bell, then you get notifications whenever new episodes are aired. And I do them habitually the first and third Monday of the month. Occasionally that will change due to family life going on, but that's my pretty regular schedule. I'm just going to pause for half a second here and plan my attack for this next little area. And I do that a lot when I'm quilting, by the way. That's kind of a thing that catches people up when they're freehand quilting, is always, I get scared and I don't know where to go next. And my advice is just pause for a second. Take a big second to look at the big picture view and decide what you want to do next, where you want to end up with your quilting, and then go back to quilting accordingly. Because I have this handy little meander fill, it's quite easy to move from one point to another. Wherever I want to meet up with the point of a goose or fill in the background, it's quite easy to do. So here, for example, I'm just going to go back and fill in this meander and be right back where I left off at the point of that goose to continue its details. And by the way, these little blocks are called flying geese, and I keep referring to a goose. I have no idea if that is correct or not, but you can't really say I'm quilting a geese. Can you? Maybe you can. thick seam there. I'm just going to slow down over that. Again, I'm going to end with just a few tight stitches where my stitching in the ditch will be on the white mountains. Again, there, like the sun and the trees, I know that I'm going to be edge stitching those with the thread like the mountain color or the sun color or the tree color, so I'm not doing stitching in the ditch with the sky colors along these other objects. A few more geese down the right hand side, and then we're going to switch colors. And we will do the sun next. Tension is just a little tight. I usually keep my bottom tension pretty constant because I tend to use the same thread all of the time. That does not change very often. And then I adjust my top tension when I need to, and I adjust it until it's almost too tight on the top. I'm just starting to see the top thread pulling more snug, and then back off just a little bit. And that way I don't typically have to worry about my bottom tension pulling tight underneath where I can't see it going on. Different machines seem to be different. I'm fortunate that Lucy is pretty good about regular tension. This goose is the Essex linen that I mentioned earlier, and I quite like having this little difference of texture. It's different to the touch, and it also just receives the quilting a little bit differently. Just adds interest, I think. A little bit further, there we go. Once again, I'm just stopping for a little plan of attack here. Okay, got it. Again, wherever those seam allowances are particularly thick, I just slow down a wee bit. It's not so thick that I'm worried about the needle, more about my hopper foot hanging up on that just a little bit and pushing it out in front of me and then getting weird stitching. And I did want to go back into that goose, back up. And so I find it easier if I just slow down a little. I will tend to get a better result. It's almost like if you go up over the hump gradually, the long arm handles it better than if you sail right up to it at high speeds and expect it to take it all in stride. Maybe that's just my Lucy, but that seems to work for me. I'm going to finish these 2 geese, and then we'll talk about our meander, feed back a little bit while I change threads and get set up for the sun. So let me know if you've got any questions to this point, or even be typing in questions, I guess, while I'm changing the thread and advancing, if you have any questions about how that's done. I am going to do a little marking on that sun, so you'll see that going on. I'm taking my own advice. I'm making myself do some of them right to left. It's really good practice. I just think that's a super important skill for a freehand quilter, is to be able to, you know, spatially place things no matter which direction you're coming at them from. Did you guys see that funny little loop that went in there? I'm going to ask Dave to look on the back side of my rails because I suspect there's a little piece of lint in my rail. So bear with us half a second here, because there was just a little bit of resistance as I went around that loop. It's about 4 inches to the right, the rail closest to you there. Yeah, perfect. So he just went at that with a little cleaning moistened cloth and wipe that out a little bit, because there's obviously something, just a little bit of lint. It's just enough to feel a tiny smidge of resistance and make a funny shaped loop. And that, by the way, is something I do quite often, is take either a moistened piece of batting or, you know, an alcohol wipe to all the rails and wheels of my machine. Because we're always working with thread and textiles, there is lint buildup that happens. And just that can be enough to make things a bit wobbly. don't think I mentioned at the beginning that I am using Hobbs 80/20 batting. I thought briefly about using wool because it would be a little puffier, maybe show off the quilting a little more. But I decided to go with my tried and true because I do have a few different types of fabric and I don't know exactly what, the shrinkage levels might be or whatever. I think the poly cotton blend is a good all-purpose choice. Doesn't give you any surprises. It has a little bit of shrinkage, but not a lot. And wool does have a bit more. So that was just personal preference. I'm not sure why I'm advancing the quilt, people, because I'm actually working on the sun. Back up. Force of habit. You come to the end of one pass and you think, oh yeah, undo everything, roll it forward. You guys can't see on camera, but my black cat, who's my faithful sidekick, is laying at the end of the long arm, just sleeping, keeping an eye on things. Okay. Yeah, let's take a few comments. Which camera do you want me on, hon? Okay. Okay. Yeah, we asked about the stippling or meandering. Northern Sioux loves stippling as a fill. It's so useful in so many ways, isn't it? Sally, I don't like doing small stippling, but I like seeing an area accented with the tiny stippling in the background, so I'm working on perfecting it. It comes in a variety of sizes, and I've certainly seen micro stippling a good deal smaller than what I have here. But I find that the 1/4 inch or a little bit less is a pretty good contrast to most of the quilting that I do. So that's the size that works well for me. I'm just going to move Lucy way to one side, and I'm going to change thread both top and bottom. And I was mentioning earlier that I like to use the same thread top and bottom. In the case of this quilt, I'm using two different but similar copper colors. They don't really show. Here we are. So for the sun, I've got this very coppery one, and I've got a bit lighter one that's going to be in my grasses, which you guys haven't seen the fabric of yet. It's the same tones, but quite a few lighter shades. Very much just a matter of preference. The copper would have worked on the grass as well, but I thought would show up quite a bit, and I really just want the texture. However, all that to say, I'm going to use the same bobbin thread for the both of these because they're pretty similar. So I think at this point, Dave, maybe that camera would be more ideal because I'm going to walk around and change the spool, and you guys don't really want a view of the back of my head, do you? So while I'm kind of off camera, that's what I'm doing. I'm just walking around and changing the spool of thread on my machine. So I don't know that this is anything I've ever shown in my live and unscripted episodes, but I'll just tell you a little bit about it. Dave's shifting cameras about. Hang on one sec. We might as well take a minute and do this. You see? You guys get to wait while we get this all set up. Okay, so here I am with my spool of thread. This is where it's going. I have my fancy dancy thread net, which is part of a lonely sock. I've just cut the toe and the heel bits off. Works beautifully for a thread net, because all I need is for my thread that's unspooling not to be able to sag down below. And so I've clipped my existing thread. It's still hanging here. It's still through all my threading apparatus, and I'm just going to knot them together. Nice and snug. And then I run around to the needle end, and I've pulled my thread out of the needle. And by the way, just tip, I always do that when I'm going to go change my thread. I just yank it out of my needle as I go by, because if I don't, I'm apt to forget when I come back, and maybe it's not as obvious as a color change like I'm doing now, and you start stitching and then that knot hits your needle and the thread breaks and goes flying, and oh my gosh, can't tell you how many times I've done that. So I just whisk it out of the needle when I'm preparing to change thread. So then when I come back to the front of my machine, I can't start stitching without having that reminder. So I just pull the whole knot all the way through, and yes, it does waste a yard and a bit of thread. However, it saves me all the time of rethreading all those apparatuses across my machine, which are quite a few on a machine my size. So it saves me that amount of time, and then I can just rethread the needle and I am good to go again. It's the same type of thread. Tension will not likely have changed. So super easy. That's it. We have our new thread color up, and I'm going to take a second also to just get a tiny scrap of batting and clean out my hopper foot a bit. It's just getting dusty from quilting, and it'll make things easier for you guys to watch. So I just take a tiny little fragment of batting off the edge of my quilt, wipe it around a little bit. Super simple. So a little scrap of batting, and I just kind of wipe off the oily residue, and I'm actually going to unthread the needle again. And just wipe around inside that hopper foot. I use one of my needles that I keep handy. Certainly you could use the end of a seam ripper, anything to just kind of wipe around in there. Clean that lint out, and we're good to go. Some quilters are very particular about re-oiling their machine with every bobbin change and things like that. I do oil my machine a lot, and so when I'm doing a project like this on camera, I usually just let it go for a few bobbins, and I've never had any trouble with that. There's plenty of oil in there in all the wicks. So in case you were wondering about that, that's my reasoning there. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of marking on this sun. I'm just thinking, if I move Lucy, is that a little bit easier to see? Good. So fairly simple. What I want to create is kind of the look of radiating rays on this sun, right? So I'm just going to mark a line from each point of this star, so these inner points and these outer points, right to the outside edge. And in most cases there's a seam at the outside edge that I can line up to. Well, I guess in half the cases. In the in-between one, I'm just eyeballing it. So halfway in between here, halfway in between down here. Did I really do that many? Okay, hang on a sec. First we're going to put the points on. I would like to look at the picture, Dave. What a genius. He's got a picture he'll just load up for me. There's the mountains, there's the grass, there's the sun. Yep, I did do one in the center of each. Okay, good. We're squared away. So I'm realizing my purple marker, this is an air erasable marker. It doesn't show up a ton on this copper, so I don't know that you guys will be able to see it. But again, I'm doing the points of the rays, the center area of the star, plus one in between. And the one in between, I'm just eyeballing both the angle and the center. It's not hypercritical. And then in every case, I'm drawing another one a 1/4 inch away. There's going to be a double line between these rays. So this is not difficult marking at all, but it does take a minute. But you'll be glad you did. It's difficult to visualize when you're in the middle of quilting it if those guidelines are not there. So it's worth taking a second to lay them down. And the air erasable markers are one of my favorites personally. I live in a dry climate, and so they last plenty long for me. If you happen to live in a humid climate, you might have to use the water erasable, because these may just disappear too quickly for you. So for me, I like the air erasable, which is always the purple. So we're just going to quilt these little double lines, will be kind of our framework, and then between them we're just going to sort of arc back and forth in simple arcs, almost like a spider web, just with closer lines, closer spaced arcs. And it just gives the impression of the rays of the sun radiating out. And then inside this little star, I'm also going to quilt some simple lines and then I think fill it with bubbles. And I just made an oops. Not too serious. Now in this case, I told you with the geese that I did not pre-mark. I was okay with the casual quality of them not being exactly uniform or symmetrical. In this case, I am marking just because the sun is a bit more of a focal point, isn't it? And so I think that will be more noticeable if I don't get these lines even. So that's why I'm taking a moment to go ahead and mark them. I learned years ago from Judy Madsen that even for the simplest of lines, if you want them to be highly accurate, you have to pre-mark them in advance. Even if you're doing a like a 1/4 inch echo, for example, around an applique. That seems very straightforward. You just place your ruler against and your hopper foot is 1/4 of an inch away. But in fact, when you go to quilting it, there can be fine variations that really show up. So if you want really accurate, the key is to pre-mark. And then you know exactly where your needle should be falling. Okay, I think that's all in place. I hope that will stay long enough for me to see. It is quite difficult to see the purple marker on the copper sun, and I have the light turned out for you guys as well. But I think we'll get it. So I'm going to start in the middle. What I think this does is really anchors all the fabric of my sun, right? Because I've got a fair size space. It's 14 or 15 inches from side to side that have no stitching, that's just loose. So if I do this star area in the middle, that will just fix it. If I were to start at one side and quilt to the other side, you know, I could risk a fabric buildup over there. Does that make sense? So that's just kind of my rule of thumb when I'm quilting. So I get areas blocked in, as the outside of this star is, and then I start from the middle and work out to keep everything kind of in place. Take a second and trim those threads off. Go around again, putting those inner points in. Now I'm going to fill that whole center with bubbles, just of a variety of sizes. Now I'm just going to travel along my previously stitched line to get to the outer edge. Now we'll start stitching our spokes. A bright girl would have started down by the mountain because that would have made me have sort of a beginning and an end to this, but as it turns out, I will probably have to stitch 3/4 of my sun and then either travel along one of these lines of stitching or break my thread and begin again to do the other 1/4 of the sun. Just thinking here. So now I've laid in my double spoke, if you will, and I'm just going to advance Lucy about 1/4 of an inch. I'm right against the front, and I can feel it there, a little bit of resistance. So it's a little tiny movement will make that easier. And now what I want to do is have 2 spokes both in place so that I can do my arcs between them. So I'm going to travel and do the spoke next. And secondly, I prefer stitching these arcs from the bottom to the top. So I'm going to go ahead and do the second side of that spoke, and now I'll go back and put those arcs in between. So I'm literally just doing a half moon shape from one side to the other. Nothing too complex here. But the effect it gives when it's done en masse is just kind of the radiating rays of the sun going outwards. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the arcs with only that one side on because I'm at the bottom. That makes sense, so I'll always start my arcing shapes from the bottom, whether I'm on the first spoke or the second. And my arcs are, well, a generous 1/2 inch apart, I would say. Second side of the spoke. Travel. And this is where you really need that marked line to know, where to travel to. Otherwise, it'd be very hard to gauge that halfway point if you didn't have any visual guide, I feel like. One side of the spoke, second side of the spoke, back up a little bit, put our arcs in. And I dip quite deeply on the sides of the arcs. If I don't, they kind of look like a zigzag climbing the ladder. Or at least that's my feeling about it. And when I need to, I'll just travel along my previous lines of stitching, whether it be spoke or whether it be arc. This is so forgiving because the thread color matches fairly well, and so you're just seeing texture. Sometimes I just have to pause and look where my next line is, because it can be really hard to see. As I mentioned, my purple is not super visible on this fabric. Another of my favorite marking tools is school chalk, and honestly school chalk might have been the better bet on this because it's white. It's just harder to keep a fine point on the chalk. I do sharpen it in a pencil sharpener, but still. It's more difficult to do fine details for sure. As you can see, I'm back to that single spoke that I put in, but no worries, I'm just skipping over it and going down the other side. Oh, do you know what? Let me think here. Yeah, no, I still don't have a good shortcut. I was just thinking about how I can do that without breaking thread or traveling, because again, that's my mental calisthenics while I'm quilting. How can I do this the most efficiently? I don't think there's an easy answer to this one. I'll have to travel, and that's okay. Now here, because I've got this mountain in underneath, I see that the line I drew on is a bit distorted. So I'm going to actually draw in a line here across my mountain, which is where that would have been, because that will give me a better idea of where to place my arcs, as though they were hidden behind the mountain. And I do this often in my quilting, when one thing is behind another. because I can't always visualize it. And so if I just go ahead and draw in the whole thing where it would be, then I can find it easier to quilt the partial thing that looks hidden. So not quite there yet. One more full arc. And then on that next one, you'll see what I mean. So there's our strip in. And I don't know if you can see, but I've got my little next spoke here. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw my arcs as though they were all the way through that mountain area. And then I'll just travel alongside the mountain to make them look like they fell in behind, or are falling in behind. I'm just backtracking on this edge stitching because this is the starting at 3/4 mark that I mentioned earlier. But I want to make sure the entire edge of this sun does have edge stitching. So there it is. So now I'm going to go back up to this corner. And I'm just going to start stitching my arcs following that purple line, which I know you can't really see, but I can. And traveling when I need to get to the next one. And that will just look like it's in behind that mountain. Likewise, I'm doing the same thing at the top, although they pretty much all show at the top end, interestingly. Put that little spoke in. So there's no set way of doing this. It's just sort of whatever fits next. You can see I'm winging it. But here again, I have another spoke, which I can see right in here. And the arcs obviously are going to fall off. So let's pretend there was an arc here and an arc here. So that's what I'm going to want to quilt, is those partial arcs. So let's get down to the bottom. And when I travel, I'm traveling on the coordinating fabric side, so that my traveling doesn't show up in the mountain in the white bits. Because again, it's going to look a little bit odd, but because it's on the back behind the mountain, and because the thread matches, it will not be very visible. And one last time, we'll draw some arcs as though the whole things were in here, the entire arc. Come on, draw. There we go. And then we'll quilt the partials. They will pretty much look like they're just tucked in behind. Just like that. A few lock stitches and our sun is finished. So we could either spritz those little marks on the mountain or leave them to fade. We'll spritz them. If I can find my spritz bottle. Maybe not. Okay, never mind that. All right, do we have any questions or comments coming in?
No, but I have a camera view.
If you have any questions, now's the moment. And I think next we're going to do some trees. I think next will be some trees, and then we'll save the mountains for this evening's session and do a whole bunch of them then. It's kind of fun to do them continuously. So, producer guy is telling me he's got a new camera view. Would I like to see it? And yes, I would. With a cat. Funny. So, and there's my spritz bottle. Ha! You guys found it! Anyway, yeah, you can see the leg of my long arm there and the power bar, and that's Kitty. He's been there since we started. Hasn't moved a muscle. Okay. I'm going to move Lucy all the way along, Dave, because I need to change the thread. Hang on a sec while we move the tripod and the camera and all the stuff. Remember I was telling you earlier that I was a guest on a show about doing live streaming called launchyour.live if you want to watch it. And we were talking about the challenges that come with live streaming, and among other things, one of the pieces of wisdom, which side do I want to be on? Ooh, you can't really see me anywhere. One of the pieces of wisdom I had is when you are streaming, do not think to yourself, oh, what do I do if something goes wrong? No, absolutely plan things will go wrong. And so, how are you going to handle it? So I mentioned that we have at times actually had an entire tripod and camera go flying. So stuff happens. Okay, Dave, what's the best camera angle? Because I'm going to walk around and change the thread on that side again. And remember my tip, pull the thread out of the needle so that you don't inadvertently start stitching with the wrong color thread in there. So again, with these greens that are coming up in the trees, there's quite a few shades of the green, and so I've picked a thread that's kind of middle of the road, slightly toward the darker shades. So here's my green. I don't know what the name of it is. It's kind of an avocado-y color, and I think it will blend well with all the greens. You're going to see it here in half a second. There we go. There's my avocado-y green thread. So once again, just snipping my existing thread, getting my high-tech thread net around my spool. I found the thread net to be essential on my machine to keep my loose bit of thread from catching. You're unwinding it at such high speeds, and it seems like it will flow easily, but it was forever catching on screws and things under here. So I'm not sure what type of machine you have or how it's built, but for me, that thread net is essential. And I keep my little clip always handy too. It's easy peasy when I want to change thread. So then I trot back around to the front and just pull the whole thing through. Because I've got the needle unthreaded, I can pull that knot all the way to the front. And all the work I have to do is to rethread the needle. If you've ever owned a serger and had to rethread it from scratch, oh boy, I can remember those hair pulling days. This is far easier than that. Okay, we have a question. Michelle, what marking pen do you recommend? Oh boy, I don't have a tried and true. The one that I was using is the purple Air Erasable, and it has no markings on it, so I'm going to say it's a no-name brand, and I'm betting I got it really inexpensively off Amazon. There are brands that are super good. I don't know that they're enough better to warrant the money of spending $3 or $4 or $5 per pencil as opposed to less than $1 a piece. I do have in the blue, which is the water erasable, I have the Lucien, I think ones, Lecien, which are short, and I quite like those. So that's my recommendations, but it's not hard and fast. I use whatever's inexpensive, frankly. Okay, we're on to a tree. I'm just going to think here half a second about my thread path. And up one. Okay. We need the ruler for the tree, so I've still got my plate on underneath. And I'm going to make loose kind of sweeping boughs on my tree. So let me just think this through. Okay. There you go. Now you can see my tree. I might as well talk it through because I have to think it through anyways. So I know that I want to stitch around the perimeter of the tree, and I know that I want to quilt the sweeping boughs from the point, and I'm going to do one side of them, and then I have to do the other side separately. So I believe I can do it. If I edge stitch to the point, do the boughs, go around the edge up to the point again, do the boughs. Make sense? We'll see if it works. You know, if it doesn't, there's no great loss. It's just a thread break. It's just fun for me to figure out how efficiently I can do it. And we do have some thick seams going on here. So I am edge stitching these trees. I will tell you, I'm not always in the ditch. In this case, I'm choosing to always stitch on the green. I want it to be a straight line of quilting, and of course I have green thread. Whoops! You guys, I nearly forgot to stitch the boughs. I have green thread, and so I want my defined edge to be within the tree and not on the green. So for this purpose, I'm going to ignore where the ditch is and just always stitch on the green. And again, I'm just eyeballing these where the center point of my tree is, and that's what I'm coming back to with each of the swoops. And I'll just let you guys watch as I do this, because I'll be fudging a little bit, backtracking a little bit, those sorts of things as I work. And if you can see a way better way to do it than I'm doing, well, you know, you can just chuckle to yourself and tell me later. Yeah, because I can see already I'm going to have some backtracking to do. Again, stitching in the green, though it is not necessarily the ditch. I'm pretty sure when I did this before I had a single thread path figured out, and I don't seem to be grasping it this time, but it's not the end of the world. It doesn't take very long to break thread and join it up again. Cut the tails from the last one. Oops. Threads everywhere. Okay. Here we go. So while I'm doing this kind of dull quilting, you guys got any pets that are working with you today? Seems like so many crafters have a little crafting buddy. And I'm very much just eyeballing these to try and make them symmetrical relative to what's on the other side of the tree that I already quilted. You could certainly draw them in if you wanted to. I'm going to advance Lucy, and if I could grasp these threads and go further on the trees. So we'll probably end up changing threads back and forth to the trees a couple of times as this progresses, because as you'll see, they're at a number of different levels, and I can't do them all in one fell swoop unless I were to pre-base the whole quilt so that I could roll back and forth without anything moving. And that would certainly be an option. It's just not my option, that's all. I'm going to take a second to buzz down this side of the quilt, and then there's a comment that I will stop and read. And I do need to have my side stretchers on. I didn't for that last bit of stitching on the tree, but I should. There we go, just gentle tension on there. Okay, we have a comment. Sally, real thread nets have snagged my fine threads. I now use a similar high-tech net, a nylon stocking. Yeah, it's kind of amazing what's in your house that will just do the same type of things, isn't it? And Sue is asking, do you ever use fabric markers to color any wayward stitches? I can't say I've ever done that on the front of the quilt, Sue. I have occasionally done it on the back of a dark quilt where fibers of batting are showing through. So there's that. I gather that you have done it. And by the way, some of you who are watching sharply may notice my earlier basting was in the teal color and now I have green on my machine and I'm going ahead and basting anyway. I'm doing that because this basting will never show. It's going to be entirely hidden in the binding. And so it doesn't really matter to me what color it is. So I'll just baste with whatever color I'm currently stitching with. How's everyone doing? Getting tired of this process? Wanting to see more of this process? I know I figured out a thread path for these trees that did it all in one fell swoop. But boy, I don't know what it was. So I'm just going to keep going. There's no point in spending a bunch of time on it either, right? That kind of defeats the purpose. So. Yeah, it just baffles me. I did say this was a reality show, right? If this was a scripted show, I'd have all these things figured out before I started. It just doesn't work that way. There has to be a better way. I just can't think of what it is. There's a really thick spot right there, and I'm just taking it easy, trying not to let my hopper foot push the fabric too far out of where I want it to be in alignment. I can really feel it just messing with trying to keep a straight line with my ruler. So slow and steady. No, bottom edge, bottom edge. If any of you clever people figure out a way to do this continuously on the whole tree, send me a drawing. It just seems so funny to me that I have done it before, and today it just won't come to me. And that's just the pressure of quilting live, that's all. Pretty sure if I start at this tip and work my way down, pretty sure I can finish this one in one fell swoop. Let's see if I'm right. There we have it. So I have an idea to try on the next tree. We'll see if I can remember it till the next session. Okay, one tree is done. A few more threads to snip. Tidy it up. I think we'll go ahead and do this other tall tree on the left because then the bulk of them are in the lower third after that point. So we'll do this tall tree. How are we doing for time, Dave? We're at 2.5 hours. Okay. That is, I believe, what we'll do. I'll do one more tree, and then I think we'll break for this session. And if I'm able to this afternoon, I'm going to go ahead and quilt. Oh, I have to get to the top of that tree. Sorry. I'm going to go ahead and quilt more of the trees this afternoon, so that when I come back for the 5 o'clock session, I can get right at the mountain, and then the grass texture is left as well. On the original pattern, Janet had suggested the word wander to be appliqued at the bottom. I might try and load a picture of the original pattern too, so you guys can see it in the later session. I'm not really a wanderer, so I chose to use explore on mine. And in the photographs we showed of the last client one that I did, she chose not to have a word at all, so you didn't see a word on the bottom. But that's just an added little thing that I'll need to be quilting today, as I need to outline around that word. So I want to be sure we have time to do mountain and grass texture and some of that word in this evening's session. So that's kind of how the plan will fall out. So if you happen to be just tuning in, working on a custom quilting project, the pattern is The Mountains Are Calling by Janet Nesbitt. Through the course of 2 sessions today, I'll be custom quilting every area of it. I may not show every moment on camera, if that makes sense, but I want to demonstrate the different techniques that I'm using. So stitching in the ditch, some basic ruler work, a number of custom fills, color changes, stops and starts, those sorts of things. So yeah, first session began at 9 this morning. Second session will begin at 5 this evening, Pacific time. And at that point, hopefully the quilt will be finished or very nearly it. At least you'll have seen all the different things going on. And I think I'm going to run out of space. I am. Look at that. I'm just running off to the side to forward Lucy just a smidge. Need about an inch more room. I'm probably going to have to joggle a couple times for this tree. Up and down. I was mentioning earlier, the original pattern was all in flannel. And so for my version, I chose to do it in various cottons out of my stash. And this dark green one that I went over just now is the smallest green that I used. There's only that one piece out of that particular green fabric. But I was determined to use the things that I had. And so there are a number of scrappy bits in here. How far do I need to get to the top? Yep, I just cannot quite reach top to bottom of the tree. So not a biggie. I'm just going to advance back and forth a few times. The other option would be to break thread a couple times. Either one works. Because of this? Ah, yes. Yep, since I'm going to advance anyway, Dave is so right. He's suggesting that I go a little further so you don't see the roll of the quilt. So that is strictly for purposes of the camera. I could have quilted there, but make it easier for you guys to see. Yep, I think I figured out my thread path. You have to start at the top of the tree with the boughs. So for the next full one, if I start at the bottom of the tree with the outlining and go up the entire outside of one side, then work my way down, putting in the boughs, then I can repeat for the other side. We'll see if it works. I'm optimistic. Okay, hang on a second. Folks, we're going to do a rewind. There is definitely something in my track. So I will get Mr. Producer Guy on the other side, and we'll see if we can determine what this is. So it's right there. You see it? Falling into that valley right there? Okay, so this is right where it is. So what we're doing, guys, because you might need to do this on your machine at home, is we're determining right where that little catch is, that little resistance. And we've determined that it's when I move from side to side, so then I'm just going to move off to one side, and since I have a helper, he's going to go after it with a moistened cloth. And if it was just me, I would determine where it was also and run to the other side of my machine and just wipe the tracks. It is still there. It's better. So while we look at that, I'll talk to you just a hair about that sort of thing. It is so critical for fine control to have absolutely smooth rolling rollers. So whatever your track system is, you need to clean it regularly to make sure there's no lint or oil buildup or anything on it. And also, you need to make sure that your machine is really level, as that can have a significant effect too on how smooth your rollers work. So it's right about there. So I'm just undoing this last little bit of stitching because I actually got 2 loops. Just because there's a little bit of resistance going on there, and it really makes a difference. And so if your machine is giving you trouble, I advise troubleshooting, and if it's given you trouble forever, I advise working on leveling it. There are some great YouTube videos out there about ways to do that. The it can be really helpful because different machines have different things that you can set a level on and that sort of thing in order to work it out. And even it can be so far as to have your rails be level to each other. And it's really deadly dull to try and figure it out, but once you do, it can make a real difference in the smoothness of your quilting. So while I've been telling that whole story, we have cleaned the rails. I have undone my little bit of stitching. Let's see if it's better. It is definitely better. And it's really interesting because today is Monday. On Saturday, I did a really thorough cleaning of my machine. I had my compressor all set up. You know, I blew out every area of my machine and table. And so that's how fast lint can build up and cause you grief. There we go, much better. And once again, I'm going to forward the quilt. As I said, you can either forward, back and forth, or break thread. Either way is acceptable. But I'm happy to note that my thread path is working. So that right there should be the only massive piece of traveling I have to do. I should be able to work my way back up to the tip and then do my bows all the way back down again. I think. And see, I was mistaken. I did this outside edge already. Okay, we'll get it right on the third tree. Now I know what I'm doing. I'm going to go ahead and break thread there and get back to the top one more time and work my way back down. So note to self, if you guys are back this afternoon and I ask you, I need to be starting in the middle of the bottom of the tree to get a continuous run. I'm going to keep trying till I get it. It matters a lot to me. So once this tree is done, we're going to head off for a break. I'm sure you guys are ready for one as well. And we'll be back, as I said, at 5 o'clock p.m. Pacific time. And we'll just pick up where we left off. If I have a chance, I will finish up the trees this afternoon, so that for sure this evening we'll be covering the stitching in the mountains. There's a couple of different textures that I'm going to use there to create differentiation between the peaks and sort of levels and distance and perspective. So we'll do the mountains, we'll do some of the grasses, we'll outline the word, and I think that's about all the textures that are left. And then as time allows, I'll do, more of the geese as we progress and things like that. My goal was to finish quilting it all in one day, but it just depends on how long things take as to whether that is realistic or not. But at least you'll get a chance to see all the different elements that I'm using. So for this afternoon, there is a secondary event on my YouTube channel, a secondary episode, I guess that's the word I want. Dave has posted those links, so you should be able to easily find it. If you have found this helpful, I do encourage you to hit like and subscribe, and even to ding on the little bell, and then you will be notified when any new episodes come your way. So with that, I think we're going to go and take a break for this afternoon. You want to put me on camera again for a sec, Dave? I don't know if there is a camera that I can be on. So I see me on camera right now. You guys are seeing my shirt. Be fabulous. Good advice. Yeah, so this is The Mountains Are Calling. Session 1 is just completed. We've done a number of the geese and the sky areas. We've done the sun in the kind of coppery colors, and we've started doing the trees. So this afternoon session at 5 PST, we'll work on the mountains, probably some more trees and some more geese here and there, and then the grasses at the bottom and outlining the fox and the word explore that's on the bottom of my quilt. So I hope you can join me then, 5 p.m. PST, and we'll see you then. Have a great afternoon or portion of the day between now and then.